Welcome back. Now we get to put it all together, the IS and the MP, into a framework. We're forecasting economic conditions and how they'll respond to monetary and fiscal policy. Basically, we're going to explain how recessions happen. So let's talk about forecasting. The IS curve illustrates how the output gap depends on the real interest rate. As a reminder, the MP curve shows what the real interest rate will be. Putting them together provides a story about the state of the economy. Step 1, we have the IS curve. Step 2, the MP curve. Putting it all together, macroeconomic equilibrium happens where the IS curve crosses the MP curve. And that macroeconomic equilibrium determines where we are on GDP. So obviously things change all the time. Let's talk about fluctuating demand in business cycles. Aggregate expenditures play an important role in determining macroeconomic equilibrium. We can explain most recessions and expansions, though not all, through the lens of expenditure changes. People's spending changes. The last few recessions, the financial crisis in 2008 was a drop in spending. 2001 also drop in spending. Early 90s, you have real estate crashes, you have stock market crashes, you have things that in the COVID-19 recession, you have both a supply side shutting down of the economy, but what the effect clearly is felt also in spending, right, as people's incomes are cut. And so as the economy is coming back, the big concern is, will people's spending come back, or will they be pessimistic? And it will take a very long time to push spending back to where it was. So that drop in spending can explain a lot of recessions, and indeed most recessions. The Great Depression was precipitated by a lot of things, but one of the big things was a stock market crash. So when wealth erodes quickly like that, people spend less, and that pulls the economy down. So booms and busts. Strong spending leads to a booming economy, full employment, right? All those good things. Insufficient demand can lead to an economic slump and unemployment. So changes in total spending or aggregate expenditures will create the fluctuations of the business cycle. So let's talk this through using the model here. We've got the optimistic IS curve. So let's assume this is people spending, right? Because the IS curve is a map of people spending. And so if they're optimistic about the economy, this is how they'll spend at each interest rate. But, and that's in boom time, but that might change, right? So if people become pessimistic, there's going to be a cutback on spending. They becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits, right? These are the things that are hard to predict. When the public mood will change. And it's consumers, but even more so it's businesses and their investment decisions. Very difficult to predict when they suddenly will sour. So the pessimistic IS curve, when the mood changes and goes south, the IS curve will shift to the left, and you're going to get a brand new macroeconomic equilibrium. And that's at a much lower GDP, obviously a larger negative GDP gap. We're smaller, the economy is now smaller than it was before. Unemployment is higher, lots of bad things are happening. And remember, it doesn't necessarily ever go back to the boom time. People can stay pessimistic for a long time because this becomes self-fulfilling. They're pessimistic about the future prospects of the economy, about the stability of their job, about their future income, and so they continue to cut back. Look at Japan in the 1990s for an example of an economy that just continually sort of stayed pessimistic. So, gut check question for you. If consumers are increasingly optimistic about the future of the economy, what would you predict? So they're getting happier and happier. Will IS curve shift to the left, to the right? Will the MP curve shift up or down? I will spare you the Jeopardy music. Let you think about this. Pause it if you like. And the answer is that it's spending, so it's the IS curve, and it's going to be shifting to the right. People spend more. So let's analyze monetary policy. Remember, the Federal Reserve changes, it's supposed to say, sorry, the Federal Reserve changes the real interest rate. Monetary policy shifts the MP curve, and the shift in that MP curve leads to a new equilibrium, so they can change the macroeconomic equilibrium. So let's say we start in a recession, early 2020, and what's likely going to be the policy response from monetary policy? Would you increase or decrease the interest rate? Think about it. Pause it if you like. You want to cut the real interest rate to make it cheaper for people to borrow and spend. And that will push GDP up, right? As people spend more, production increases, unemployment drops, and you get an improvement in GDP. So the negative GDP gap is eliminated. Another gut check question. Let's say we're at a real interest rate of 5% and the actual output is 8% below potential output. So negative 8% GDP gap. If you want to close the gap, and of course the Fed does, it is mandated to do so, what will it do? Remember, the Fed is one of the two policy arms, right? The Fed does monetary policy, the federal government does fiscal policy. We're focusing just on the Fed right now. The federal government may have some tricks up its sleeve too, but what's the Fed going to do? They're going to A, increase the key interest rate, the federal funds rate, or B, decrease it. Pause it, think about it if you like. So the state of the economy rather is a recession, right? Or you're below potential output. So you're going to want to cut interest rates. B is the correct answer. So that federal government, maybe they have some tricks up their sleeve, right? What could they do? They can also influence the economy through fiscal policy. So that's changes in government spending or taxes. And when they adjust fiscal policy, guess what? It affects our spending through the IS curve. So there is a thing called the multiplier. If you want to know more about the math of it, it lives in one of the appendices of the book. But think about this. When I spend $1, when you spend $1 in the economy, that dollar functions like yeast. It's going to actually create more than $1 worth of spending. It's, pardon my French, effing magic, because you've got this idea that your spending depends on my spending, right? And vice versa. When I spend $1 at Trader Joe's then spends a lot of that dollar on employee wages, but also on supplies, right? From wholesalers. So you're going to get this idea that my dollar's worth of spending generates more than $1, right? Because Trader Joe's is going to spend, let's say, 90% of it to their wholesalers and their workers. Those workers and wholesalers are going to spend 90% of it, and it generates a lot of spending. So the multiplier is a measure of how much GDP changes when, let's say, the government increases, pumps some money into the economy for the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's say they it's much more than this, but they put in $100 million. There's going to be a lot more than $100 million generated. So how much total spending, change in GDP there on the left, is going to depend on how much they initially injected, that new change in spending, times whatever the multiplier is. Now, what's the magic math of the multiplier? All you need to know is, well, I'll ask you to think about this. The more we spend of each dollar, the farther each dollar goes, right? If people were saving more of their money, the new spending couldn't go as far because people are holding on to it rather than spending it. So when you spend more, when your economy is a low saving economy, changes in spending have much more magnified effects, both positive and negative. A drop in spending has a massively negative effect too, a deflating effect. So the multiplier is a really cool thing. And it means that basically a little injection can go a long way. So here's a gut check question for you. If people begin to save more, what happens to the size of the multiplier, do you think? Pause and think about it if you like. And the answer is B, it will decrease. And this is a problem in a pandemic situation or any other sort of very steep recession. You're going to get people increasingly trying to save money to protect their incomes, to protect their ability to live, basically. And if they can save, not everybody can save, right? You've probably seen some of the data about almost half of Americans couldn't come up with $400 if they needed to for an emergency. So that's the cold, hard truth of the American economy. There's lots more to say about that. But the multiplier rises when people begin to save more money. And in a recession, if they can save more money, they will. Notice that's going to make the recession worse, right? And it's also going to make it harder for policymakers to push us out of the recession through lowering interest rates or cutting taxes or increasing spending, because it's just not going to go as far because we're saving it. So let's talk about changes in fiscal policy and how that looks on our model. So this change in government spending. So let's say in the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress passes the CARES Act and passes a bunch of new spending aimed at making up for lost wages for people. So through the magic of the multiplier, we know that's going to increase spending, right? Remember, the IS curve is made up of 4 types of spending: consumer, business, or I, G, or government, and then net exports. Government spending directly is increased, and so that's one of the 4 components. You have to shift your IS curve to the right. And we've got a new equilibrium. And remember, the multiplier is going to be working. Government puts in 100 million, and that's going to get spent and respent depending on how much we save versus spend, and that's going to yield a new equilibrium, a happier one. So there's your expansionary fiscal policy, how that looks on the ISMP framework rather. If the economy is in a recession, the government reduces taxes. What's this going to do? First of all, is that the correct thing to do? Cut taxes? Yes. That's the correct direction for policy to go, because you want people to spend more, right? You want to shift your IS curve towards happier. I don't want to give it away, right? So the government is reducing taxes. That's good. That's the right direction. It's one thing they could do. This causes the IS curve to do what? A, shift to the right, B, shift to the left. Pause it and think about it if you like. And the answer? A, shift to the right. So, to review, the ISMP framework is used to forecast economic conditions and determine how they respond to monetary and fiscal policy. The ups and downs of the business cycle reflect shifts in aggregate demand. Monetary policy shifts the MP curve, fiscal policy shifts the IS curve, and the multiplier determines how far the IS curve shifts. So now you know how policymakers can and do positively, hopefully, influence the economy, stabilize the economy, and you also know a few of the sort of shortcomings or challenges. All right, you down with ISMP? Yeah, you know me.